My name is Julie Young, and I'm a professor. What does diversity mean to me? I conceptualize diversity as an anti-oppression framework as opposed to multicultural celebrations. I view it as something that's more holistic and inclusive and challenging and raw and difficult and complex. Personal experience with diversity and inclusion. Where do I start? I think my inherent passion about diversity and inclusion originates in childhood. I'm the product of an interracial marriage in a time of segregation. My father left his home country, traveled to the United States, and studied university during the Civil Rights Movement, and was really active with Martin Luther King and a lot of the activities at that time. And I grew up on those oral stories, or sort of that handing down of that oral tradition in our family. So I think coming into my early university years, it was a natural progression for me to be a social activist, for me to get really involved in student politics, and for me to want to contribute to any activities that fostered social inclusion, positive social change, and social justice. And I would say today, as I engage in my work as an educator and a researcher, I continue to value those things that I learned in those very early days. And I think I have a broadened perspective of the world around me given that early experience. What does my sector look like? Well, this week I was at an academic conference, participated in an academic conference, and we were conversing about inclusivity in the cities. It was post-election. People were feeling deeply. There were lots of difficult conversations happening during breaks. And it was a really powerful and meaningful conversation, I believe, that we were engaged in. There was an Indigenous scholar on one of the panels that we heard from that day. And I couldn't help but thinking, as I looked around the room, that the room was primarily filled with academics and tenured faculty members who were mostly older white men. And that grieved my heart. Not because I don't feel that these individuals have something very significant to contribute to scholarship, but that part of the story is just being left out. And whether that be in the classroom, where students from various groups may never have the opportunity to, let's say, have a black professor, or whether that's when we're conducting research and we want to tell the stories of communities and we want to contribute to the discourse in a way that we're moving towards positive social change. I don't see that we can do this in a holistic way, leaving behind the lived experience of whole segments of the population. So from an industry perspective, I would hope to see a more vibrant and inclusive academia. Why do we avoid difficult conversations? Because they're difficult. Because it means that we need to be vulnerable. Because it forces us to behave in ways that are more transparent. Because acknowledging power and privilege means that we might be part of the problem. And so we don't want to have difficult conversations because an illusion of colorblindness, for example, is one that allows us to move freely in this world without really thinking about the ways in which we're participating in a system and contributing to or enabling structures, broader structures of inequality. So I think we need to be willing to be vulnerable and open and uncomfortable. And we are not going to be able to deconstruct power and privilege and social inequality with any measure of effectiveness without being willing to be uncomfortable. How can leaders start having these difficult conversations? I really don't believe that social change is going to happen until those who are not disproportionately affected are as equally outraged as those who are disproportionately affected. And so how does that relate to your question? Well, I think those with power and privilege need to take responsibility for starting the conversation, for asking difficult questions, and then having ears and hearts to actually listen. And I'd like to maybe suggest one other thing. I went to a conference about a year and a half ago on community development, and the conference took place in Memphis. And there was members of the Black Lives Movement at the conference. And there was a focus at that conference, and I hadn't really considered it until that time, but there was a focus at that conference on the process of lament. This powerful idea that people can come together to collectively grieve and mourn societal injustice and oppression and difficult things. And it was very powerful to experience as an academic because it challenges this positivist notion of objectivity, where we articulate science in such a way that it is completely and utterly disconnected from our humanity, that we leave our feelings at the table and we show up and we're in the pursuit of real science in a similar way to the natural sciences, let's say. But the reality is that human beings and communities are very complex, and we can never underestimate who we are when we show up to do our work. So this lesson of lament for me at this conference, to be sharing a space with other scholars, but also practitioners and individuals, volunteers who are engaged in social movements and in various communities, mostly throughout the United States, coming together through song and dance and poetry and very unconventional ways at a conference to publicly lament, to just grieve and mourn together the loss, the racism, the lost opportunity, the loss of potential, the loss of human life. For, as an academic, to have the opportunity to lament with my brothers and sisters on things that grieve their hearts was transformational for me. So I'm not suggesting I have an answer to how we go about this, but I ponder as a scholar, is there room to integrate this idea of lament in our work, particularly if it's focused on social inequality? What power could be found in partnering with members of vulnerable and marginalized groups to just grieve with them over the things that pain them? How would that shift my perspective as a scholar as I then decide to go and study them? I think that there could be a transformational opportunity if we would just slow down and not rush to have all of the answers and allow our full human experience to be shared with those that we hope to study and ultimately help. So I just wonder about the transformational power of a process of lament, where we come together and collectively grieve and mourn and use that lived experience to inform our scholarship. And that really resonates for me. I think it also fits nicely with Indigenous scholarship or Black feminist epistemologies, that we're valuing lived experience as a valid form of knowledge in the same way that we value more empirical forms of knowledge that are more traditional in an institution such as this. So at the end of the day, I just hope for more holistic, inclusive, and ultimately vibrant and hopeful places of work, communities, and the world more broadly. The benefits and the barriers. Well, the benefits, of course, something is truly lost when potential is left unrealized. And we just have one sliver of an entire story. So imagine if you were reading your most favorite novel, but you only got to read to page 20. Well, this wouldn't be a very good experience. So I conceptualize a lack of diversity as only getting to page 20 or chapter 1. I mean, we just haven't even scratched the surface of a complete inclusive story. So we all stand to benefit from inclusion. But I think a lack of inclusion or a lack of diversity in many places is so commonplace that it's what we come to expect. And that's difficult because once something becomes normative, we can walk into a new space. We don't expect to experience diversity in particular places in our institutions, in our society. And once we don't have any positive expectation or of representation, I believe that can trickle down to a place where people won't strive to achieve their full potential, or they don't believe that certain opportunities are available to them because they've never seen anyone who represents their unique vantage point in various institutions. So you think of a small child who's never seen a Muslim school teacher, and they may not then strive to reach that position themselves because they don't even believe it's possible. So I don't say that to be a source of discouragement or despair. Of course, I always think we need to circle back to hope 100% of the time. And there have always been people who have not been willing to accept the status quo. And so we need to always strive to not settle for what is probable, but to always strive for what's possible in face of whatever the barriers are. So barriers, well, I think having an honest conversation is the first starting point towards deconstructing power and privilege in a way that can move us towards positive social change. But let's be honest, if you have power, you potentially have something to lose. So if we conceptualize diversity then as an anti-oppression framework, as opposed to a fanciful celebration of multiculturalism. I'm not against a celebration of multiculturalism, of course, but an anti-oppression framework of diversity moves us more into a dimension of complexity and discomfort, but potentially towards a place of justice and social equality. But social change is never an easy thing to accomplish. So in terms of barriers, I think, there's going to always be resistance to change because it means that the outcomes might be different for those with power and privilege. And that's okay. No one said it would be easy. I think we still need to move towards a more positive outcome for the betterment of mankind. Any advice for leaders or emerging leaders? So I think that change takes place outside of our comfort zone. So I would suggest that people of influence, individuals with influence, engage other leaders, perhaps community leaders or folks with alternative perspectives, engage and include them in conversations. I mean, it sort of starts with a conversation. So let's take, for example, the university environment. Who could we invite to engage in a speaker series that might be controversial, that might cause us to feel uncomfortable, that might cause us to think in new ways about the things that we've come to accept about the world that we live in? Those might serve to be tremendous opportunities to start difficult conversations to move us towards social change. And I guess the other piece is, I think the more that we get to know people that aren't just like us, and we have deep, intimate, meaningful friendships and relationships, that can also serve as a source of transformation or a source of change in our own thinking. For emerging leaders, this is what makes me most excited and most enthusiastic and most hopeful and makes me feel so privileged. I mean, I know I say to my students on a regular basis that I feel so blessed and so privileged to spend 3 hours with them. And I don't say that because it sounds like a nice thing to say. I honestly feel like I pinch myself because I get to spend my time with people who are hopeful, who don't want to accept the status quo, who are tremendously optimistic about a hopeful future. And I believe it is a hopeful future. And I believe that change is possible. I believe we can eradicate poverty in my lifetime. I mean, I believe these crazy things. And I think that we have to move from a place of hope in order to achieve what feels like an impossible dream. We have to actually work as though we believe change is possible in order for it to be possible. It doesn't mean it isn't difficult. So in terms of advice to emerging leaders, I would say don't allow yourself to be isolated. Sometimes when we get focused on difficult work, anti-oppression work, I think we run the risk of becoming discouraged or maybe despairing because the problem seems so big and we just can't imagine how we could ever tackle these massive problems. But there are others who share in our vision, in our hopes, in our dreams, and even in our moments of despair. And so I think if we make a deliberate effort to share the company of others who really want to see that kind of change and are willing to dedicate their life's work to realizing that change, that's a beautiful place to be. And I guess finally I would want to say to an emerging leader, you showed up here with work to do. And if you decide to not realize your potential and use the unique talents, gifts, and abilities and connections that only you have, that the world will not be what it could have been without you. And get yourself a mentor, get yourself connected, because we want you to win. You're the only hope we have. So get to work.